Also to ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's response is to reports that the highest proportion of positive COVID-19 tests is among young adults.
First Minister.
Well, obviously, the virus is spreading again. That's obvious from the figures we've been reporting in recent days. And we know that there has been a larger number of young adults returning positive tests than was the case earlier in the pandemic, although our testing approach is different now to then, so that will to some extent account for that. But more recently, the 18 to 39-year age group has shown the highest number of positive cases. That's not surprising. I made this point last week. Young people are more likely to be exposed to the virus because they are more likely to be back at work and being required to be in higher risk situations. Young people are more likely to live in shared accommodation. So it's really important for all of us to say that the increase in cases amongst the younger age groups is not their fault and it's not something they should be blamed for. That said, it's not something that we can or should be complacent about. Younger people are less likely to become seriously ill or die from COVID, but they can still become gravely ill, and of course we know that many people who get COVID and never go to hospital suffer long-term health complications, and we saw a 29-year-old from Aberdeen report his experience of that just last week. And of course we know that if the virus spreads in the younger age groups, it will eventually spread into older age groups who we know are at greater risk of illness and death, and that's when we unfortunately would start to see cases of hospital admissions, intensive care admissions and deaths rise. And if we look at countries, for example France right now, that is the trend that we're seeing there, which is why it's so important for everybody to stick to the restrictions now so that we can try to stem this.
Stuart McMillan.
Thank the First Minister for that reply. And she clearly is concerned, and every MSP should be concerned, about the reports of house parties continuing, despite the measured approach taken by the Scottish Government and also Police Scotland. And nobody wants an excessive and heavy-handed approach during this challenging time. However, with the greater numbers of local authorities under stricter lockdown measures and COVID-19 cases increasing daily, does the First Minister now consider it appropriate that tougher fines should be implemented for the hosts of house parties?
First Minister.
I think this is a legitimate issue. It's the same issue Christine Graham raised last week, because I hear her reminded me of that behind me. And these are important issues, and we continue to keep all of this under review. I think it's also important that we don't just think where there are really egregious breaches of the regulations, we don't just think of fixed penalty fines, but also the police are able to take more serious prosecution action as well. I think the vast majority of people are abiding by the restrictions, and I think even where some are not, that will not be deliberately. It may be through a lack of understanding, and that's why it's so important that we continue to try to explain exactly what we're asking people to do and why. But of course, where people are just flagrantly breaching the rules, that should be treated seriously. House parties right now, I understand that young people want to socialise and see friends. Of course I do. There's nothing more natural than that. But house parties right now are a danger. They're a danger to people's health, and frankly, they're a danger to life. And Police Scotland responded to 405 house parties across the country last weekend. So that both demonstrates that we still have to get this message across to people, but also that police are taking appropriate action. Any breaches of the regulations may be subject to enforcement action, including fixed penalty notices that can double for repeat offences up to £960. Where prosecution is deemed appropriate, the Sheriff Court can impose a fine of up to £5,000, and higher fines can be imposed dependent on the charge libelled. But we will continue to keep the level of fines and the enforcement action under review.